Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the state of 4 stars going forward and kind of what we've seen from trends in Inazuma and with Goro coming out, especially what we can kind of expect the direction Mihoyo to take in designing 4 stars in the future. So the thing with most 4 stars added since Inazuma is that they're more or less designed to support a specific character or with a very specific purpose in mind instead of being designed just to be a standalone unit and then there being synergies that exist between the units. What do I mean by this? So let's go with like the most obvious though. And the most obvious one is that Sarah is a attack buffer who just so happens to be Electro, have an 80 cost burst, has an attack buff that lasts, roughly 6 seconds, and happens to have a constellation that increases the crit damage of Electro characters. She's more or less perfectly designed for the Raiden Shogun. Her attack buff lasts just long enough for Raiden to get a lot of value out of it. With her ultimate, she buffs Electro crit damage. She has a high cost ultimate, something that's a little weird given if you look at her kit, but kind of makes sense in terms of the fact that they want her to work with the Raiden Shogun. It kind of makes more sense why she would have a high cost burst then. But because of this, she isn't kind of generically a powerful unit despite having stuff like an attack buff that would stereotypically make her quite a good unit. And then you have Toma, who originally people thought he was going to be a Pyro Jingchu, but as soon as I saw HP scaling, I kind of knew he was going to be more pigeonholed into kind of just a supportive shielder personally. But he is essentially a supportive shielder unit that applies a little bit of Pyro. But the little thing that's a little weird is how often his skill here, this Fiery Collapses ultimate, actually sends out its Pyro damage. And it feels like it is almost 100% done on purpose so that he works well with Hu Tao instead of just being a really powerful Pyro sub DPS. He also has a Constellation that increases normal charge and plunging attack damage, which again feels like it's a little bit more Hu Tao centric, or possibly even Yoimiya, because both of them, the other fire characters don't necessarily focus so much on normal and plunge attacks. I guess Klee does, but like Diluc doesn't really. So it just makes him and like you wouldn't want this for someone like Child either, really. So it makes it seem like he's very much designed for Hu Tao. And Goro, who is the unit we know is coming out, he has a mechanic where the more Geo units in your party, you get essentially a different kind of buff. I think it's 1, 2, and 3. I think 1 is something like stagger resistance, 2 is defense, 3 is Geo damage. To essentially encourage him to be a Geo entirely centric unit, or at least be a triple Geo unit designed almost entirely for Ito. This is not going into leaks or anything. This is just off what they told us on the live stream. And Saiyu, who is kind of the first one, she didn't necessarily come attached with a character, but due to the way she works with her role, just kind of like getting around, and her passive being about collecting items in the world. This is or crystallize. Sorry. It makes me feel like she was designed more or less to kind of just be a taxi to get you around the open world, and not necessarily used in combat as much. She doesn't really have any particularly strong synergies, but it seems like this is the direction they want to go going forward, which is to create units that are more role players instead of creating generally powerful units and just kind of letting us make teams with them. Now, there are good and there are bad things that come out of this. So the first, obviously bad thing is this means that these characters are going to be a little bit more pigeonholed than previous characters. Someone like Jingchu or even Fischl or Rosaria just kind of work wherever you really want to put them. Whereas these characters would be more specific. But because they're more specific, this is also good because this means that they're not necessarily a necessity for most players to roll on and try to get. That was kind of like my concern with a lot of these 4 stars as we go on. Because power creeping 5 stars is one thing, but power creeping like the fundamental units, like the core units that build up the support cores of most teams, that's kind of another issue entirely. And if it was like, oh, yeah, your C6 Jingchu isn't worth that much anymore because you have a Toma. I know it can be kind of bad feeling if you like Toma more, but realistically, this is better for especially anyone who started, before the beginning of the game. But up until this point, you'll have more chances to get these older characters, and them being more generic is kind of good in that reason. Now, there is actually another problem with a lot of these new 4 stars, which people don't really like to talk about, so let's go into that. The other problem with a lot of these 4 stars is, if you saw when I was looking at Toma and I was looking at Sarah, is that it seems like parts of their kits were stripped away to be sold behind Constellations. Both of these having C6s that kind of are really nice for the teams that these units are wanted in. Um, Obviously, I don't know if Gore is the same way, but even Saiyu's C6 necessarily allowing her to be built, you know, for purely for elemental mastery, which is what Swirl kind of scales off naturally. So it's kind of like what she naturally would want to be built with is a lot of Yem. Um, Kind of fixing problems that the kits have, or not necessarily fixing, but adding features that feel like they're supposed to be baseline to the kit. This is something that's been happening a little bit more recently, where you're seeing essentially in the early parts of the game, and for the first little bit, constellations were essentially just damage bonuses. Maybe they add a little something something, but generally it's just a damage bonus. Whereas here, it seems like they're actually selling you features for their kits, like with Kujosara's like Electro bonus buff. It seems like that's something that was designed for her, but it's for some reason it's locked behind Constellations. Whereas like if you look at a character like Fischl, right, her C6 essentially just like spawns another instance of damage, so it's a damage increase, but it's not like completely it doesn't add another functionality to her kit. Why can't I find her? 1 second. Yeah, here we go. So the way this works is Oz is just on the field longer, and you essentially get a little extra hit of electro damage every so often. Essentially, it's like having part of an extra Oz firing, which does help trigger some of her other abilities. It is very good, but it very much doesn't change where she's useful. Whereas like Sarah, for example, is she's a really good support for Raiden, but is she that good without the C6 here? Like Toma is quite a good support for Hu Tao, but without his C4 here to essentially remove his or drastically cut down on his energy issues, which allows you to build more HP, so his shield can actually be really useful. Like without that, is he even that good? Without this 15%, what makes him really better than just another like random pyro unit? Besides the fact, of course, he has a shield. But it seems like a lot of these newer characters kind of have solutions baked into their constellation for problems. Where a lot of these older 5 stars, Jingchu all the way through, these are just all essentially little bits of damage increase, Zhangling here, a couple little utility things, but like, this is, this one here, just more duration on the ult. You get some like pyro damage bonus, you get some like pyro res shred. There isn't really like stuff that helps them, essentially unlocking like a new ability or a new use for them that late in Constellations for a lot of the older characters. So that is kind of worrying going forward, and I think that is kind of the more important thing to worry about compared to like how niche a lot of the new characters are going to be, because I think that being niche is not necessarily a bad thing as long as they still have a niche, right? Like, I think Saiyu is more or less a little bit of a misstep because she doesn't really have a use in combat besides, like, just open world exploring. But I think Sarah, Toma, and even Goro will be fine. The only problem is, I hope going forward they, lessen up a little bit on the selling the solution through Constellations. But if you have any opinions on this topic, I'd love to hear them below. And I hope you come back. Or I hope you come back for another video. I think our next one is probably going to be... Probably going to talk about that KFC glider. So if you want some spicy hot takes on that, we'll probably be doing that tomorrow or the day after that. But I hope to see you again. And I hope this was, at least mildly entertaining.